Paris, the morning of April 13, 1888. During the Belle Époque, spring was not merely a season, but a state of mind. The air over the aristocratic Boulevard Malesherbes was thick with the scents of blooming chestnut trees, the expensive perfumes of ladies hurrying about their business, and fresh brioches from fashionable bakeries. In his luxurious yet surprisingly austere mansion, which resembled more a laboratory and library than the home of a multimillionaire, a man sat at a massive mahogany desk. His face, framed by a dense beard already streaked with gray, was etched with wrinkles, the marks not so much of age, he was only 55, but of sleepless nights in laboratories, endless journeys in rattling carriages, and a deep, bone-weary melancholy. This was Alfred Nobel, the owner of 93 factories across 5 continents, a brilliant chemist, the author of 355 patents, a polyglot fluent in 6 languages, an amateur poet, and perhaps the loneliest man on the planet. Following a ritual honed over decades, he unfolded a fresh copy of an influential Parisian newspaper. His eyes, accustomed to gleaning the substance from complex chemical formulas and stock market reports, scanned the columns. Political intrigues of the shaky Third Republic, falling shares on the London Stock Exchange, the announcement of a new opera at the Grand Opéra, the usual morning routine. And then, suddenly, he froze. His heart, accustomed to a steady, measured beat, stumbled, missed a beat, and then began to pound with a frantic, deafening force. On one of the pages, framed by a thick black mourning border, was his own surname. The newspaper dispassionately reported the death of Alfred Nobel. The journalists had made a monstrous, unforgivable error. A few days earlier in Cannes, on the fashionable French Riviera, one of the Nobels had indeed passed away. His older brother, Ludwig, the oil king of Baku, a titan of industry who had transformed Russia's backward oil fields into a giant, cutting-edge enterprise that challenged America's Rockefellers. But the reporter, chasing a big name, hadn't bothered to check the facts and had blithely buried the wrong brother. For anyone else, such a mistake might have prompted an angry letter to the editor or a dark joke among friends. For Alfred, it became a mirror from hell, into which he was forced to gaze for the first time in his life. The headline, set in large, merciless type, struck like a backhanded slap. What followed was text in which every word was like a drop of acid, slowly burning through his consciousness. The publication impassively stated, "In an instant, his entire carefully constructed system of self-justification collapsed. All his patents, all his titanic work, his sincere belief that he was serving progress and moving humanity forward, it all turned to dust, to toxic smoke. In the eyes of the world, the very world he sought to change, he was not a genius who had paved civilization's path through mountains and across oceans. He was merely a manufacturer of death, the Dr. Frankenstein of his era, whose name would be forever seared into history with a branding iron, linked to the roar of cannons, the scream of shells, and the smell of torn human flesh. This mistaken obituary was not just a slap in the face. It was a verdict, the final, unappealable judgment of history, read to him while he was still alive. He understood with a horrifying, nauseating clarity. After his actual death, they would write the same thing. Perhaps they would choose more polite euphemisms, but the essence would remain, and that thought was absolutely unbearable. Is this it? The question beat inside his skull like a trapped bird. Is this all that will remain of me? The brand of a killer, a cursed fortune built on blood, and eternal damnation for any good I tried to do? It was on that day, in the echoing silence of his Parisian study, that many biographers believe the seed of an idea was planted in his tormented soul. An idea that was desperate, brilliant, and utterly paradoxical. An idea that was meant not just to correct his legacy, but to detonate it, to reassemble it from the ashes into something entirely new and everlasting. The idea of a prize, the most prestigious and significant award in human history, an award for peace. But how did a man whose name had become synonymous with war come to be the planet's chief peacemaker? To understand this incredible twist of fate, one must rewind the film of his life back to the very beginning, to the cold, wind-swept city of Stockholm in the mid-19th century, to a family where genius and poverty were inseparable twin sisters, and the acrid, bitter smell of gunpowder was more familiar than the aroma of freshly baked bread. Alfred Bernhard Nobel was born in the autumn of 1833. He was the third son of Emmanuel Nobel, a human firework, a human catastrophe. An engineer, architect, and inventor, he gushed with ideas, but was completely devoid of business acumen. His main passion, his obsession, was explosives. He saw controlled explosions as the key to the future, a panacea for all construction and mining problems. But the Swedish army distrusted his designs for underwater mines. Builders feared his powder charges, and the family, slowly but surely, sank into a morass of abject poverty. They lived hand to mouth on watery soup, mending old clothes until they were threadbare. It reached a point where bailiffs even removed little Alfred's wooden cradle from their home. Alfred himself grew up a sickly and frail child, a perpetual victim of colds, coughs, and agonizing migraines. Due to his poor health, he barely attended school, spending his days in a dimly lit room with books and his own dark fantasies. But Emmanuel, while a terrible businessman, proved to be a brilliant teacher. He educated his sons, Robert, Ludwig, and Alfred himself, teaching them physics, chemistry, and engineering, and infecting them with his own indomitable faith in the limitless potential of the human mind. Salvation came from the vast and mysterious Russian Empire. In 1842, fleeing debtor's prison, Emmanuel escaped to St. Petersburg, and there, in the imperial capital, his talent was finally appreciated. His machine shop received a major military contract. Emmanuel's finest hour came during the Crimean War. His naval mines, laid around the naval fortress of Kronstadt, prevented the mighty Anglo-French fleet from even approaching the capital. The admirals were furious, and the emperor was delighted. Money poured in. The family was reunited in St. Petersburg. From Swedish poverty, they were plunged into a world of luxurious mansions on the Neva, balls at the Winter Palace, and intellectual salons. For young Alfred, it was a culture shock and an incredible catalyst for development. His father hired the best tutors for his sons, including the renowned chemist Nikolai Zenin. By 17, Alfred was a brilliantly educated young man, fluent in 5 languages, including impeccable Russian. He voraciously consumed knowledge of chemistry and physics, but his soul, to his father's horror, belonged to literature. He idolized the English Romantic poet Percy Bysshe Shelley, and the French tragedian Victor Hugo. He wrote poetry himself, full of youthful pessimism and world weariness, and even began work on a verse play, dreaming of literary fame. But the practical Emmanuel saw him not as a poet, but as the heir to his engineering business. To, as he put it, he sent him on a 2-year educational tour of Europe and America. This journey became the turning point of his life. In Paris, in the laboratory of the famous chemist Théophile Jules Pelouse, 17-year-old Alfred met a young Italian named Ascanio Sobrero. 3 years before their meeting, Sobrero, while experimenting with glycerin, had synthesized a new substance, a heavy, oily, colorless liquid. He called it, the world would come to know it as, this substance was like a demon released from a bottle. Its explosive force was 13 times greater than that of black powder, but it was monstrously capricious and unpredictable. It would explode from the slightest jolt, from a sudden rise in temperature, from friction, and sometimes for no apparent reason at all. Sobrero himself was terrified of his creation. During one experiment, an explosion disfigured his face, leaving him scarred for life. He considered nitroglycerin a curse on science and begged all his colleagues to stay away from it, calling it far too dangerous to even consider for practical use. But young Alfred Nobel was not afraid. He was mesmerized. He looked at this and saw not only a deadly threat, but also an unprecedented creative power capable of changing the face of the planet. He saw the future, a future of tunnels piercing mountains, canals connecting oceans, mines delving into the deepest bowels of the earth, and, of course, wars that would become even more terrible. His obsession with nitroglycerin consumed him completely. This dangerous, unrequited passion would define the rest of his life. He did not yet know that it would bring his family fame, immense wealth, and a terrible, everlasting sorrow. The race to tame the explosive demon had begun, and the first victim it would claim would be the youngest of the Nobel brothers. The golden age of the Nobel family in the Russian Empire came to a crashing end like a snapped steel cable. In 1856, the Treaty of Paris, humiliating for Russia, brought the Crimean War to a close. For Emmanuel Nobel, it was not just the end of a war, it was the end of his world. The massive factory, which only yesterday had been running in 3 shifts, producing not just mines, but also steam engines, machine tools, and artillery carriages, ground to a halt overnight. The new emperor, Alexander II, embarking on his, was focused on liberalization and cutting military spending. He had little interest in yesterday's inventions. The wheel of fortune, which had so generously favored the family, had made a full and merciless turn. From industrial kings, the Nobels were once again bankrupts, hounded by an army of creditors. In 1859, a broken, aged, and ruined Emmanuel Nobel, along with his wife Carolina and youngest son Emile, was forced to flee Russia, leaving behind colossal debts and the ruins of his business. It was not a homecoming, but a shameful exile, a return to the very poverty from which he had once escaped. 26-year-old Alfred and his older brothers Robert and Ludwig remained in St. Petersburg, desperately trying to salvage what was left of the family empire. But it was too late. The factory was sold at auction for a pittance. Here the brothers' paths diverged forever. The pragmatic and energetic Robert and Ludwig, who had inherited their father's engineering talent, but not his fatal business naivety, turned their gaze south to the wild and untamed Caucasus. There, near Baku, a black, pungent liquid, oil, gushed from the earth. They saw the future in it, and starting with a tiny kerosene plant, built their own equally grand empire known as the Nobel Brothers Petroleum Production Company, which became the main rival to America's Standard Oil. Alfred, however, was a different sort of man. Oil did not entice him. His mind, his soul, was still captive to one all-consuming idea brought back from that Parisian laboratory: nitroglycerin. That had become his obsession, his curse, and his only hope. Returning to his parents in Stockholm, to bleak poverty, he threw himself into his research, turning a shed in the backyard of their modest home into a chemical laboratory. It was here, amidst the acrid fumes of nitric and sulfuric acid, that father and son, soon joined by the youngest brother, 20-year-old Emile, began their deadly games. Every day was a dance on a volcano. Nitroglycerin behaved like a living, malevolent creature. They tried mixing it with gunpowder, with sawdust, seeking a way to make it less sensitive. Explosions became commonplace. Windows would be blown out, a door torn from its hinges, or one of the experimenters would be deafened for hours. But Alfred was obsessed. Then, in 1863, he made his first real breakthrough. He invented the detonator. He realized that a small but powerful initial impulse was needed to reliably detonate the unstable substance. A copper cap filled with mercury fulminate became the key that allowed the explosion to be initiated from a safe distance. It was a victory. The family, having borrowed money, immediately founded the world's first factory for liquid explosives, Nitroglycerin Aktiebolaget. Orders from railroad and mine builders poured in. It seemed fortune was smiling on them once more. And then came September 3rd, 1864, the day that split Alfred's life into, quote, 15 and, quote, 16, leaving a raw, unhealing wound in his soul. On that fateful day, work was in full swing at the Helenborg laboratory. Among the workers was the youngest brother, 21-year-old Emile. He was the pride of the family, smart, handsome, charming, having just graduated with honors from Uppsala University. He had plunged into the family business with youthful enthusiasm, seeing a great future in it. Alfred himself was not at the factory. He was away negotiating with representatives of the Swedish state railways. Suddenly, Stockholm was shaken by a deep, crushing blow, as if a giant hammer had struck the earth from beneath. In houses several kilometers from Helenborg, windows rattled and shattered. Over the site where the factory had stood, a sinister yellowish-brown cloud slowly rose into the sky. When the smoke cleared, a deep, smoldering crater, littered with charred debris, gaped where the laboratory had been. Everyone inside, Emile and 4 other workers, was quite literally vaporized. There was nothing left of them to bury. For the family, it was an apocalypse. 70-year-old Emmanuel, their father, could not withstand the shock. He was struck by a massive stroke. He remained confined to a wheelchair for the rest of his life, unable to speak, a living monument to the tragedy, his eyes forever frozen in an expression of silent horror and grief. For Alfred, it was a personal hell. Guilt became his shadow, his constant companion. His mind screamed. The city was furious. Newspapers branded him the The authorities immediately passed a law forbidding any production or even storage of nitroglycerin within the city limits and its surroundings. Any other man would have broken. He would have abandoned it all, cursing the day he ever heard of nitroglycerin. But Alfred was forged from a different metal. Grief did not stop him. It transformed his obsession into a sacred duty. He had to win, for Emile. He had to make nitroglycerin safe, so that his brother's death would not be in vain. If he couldn't work on land, he would work on water. Nobel bought an old cargo barge, anchored it in the middle of the cold, leaden waters of Lake Malarin, and turned it into a ghostly floating laboratory. Far from everyone, rocked by the waves, under a piercing wind, he single-handedly continued his deadly experiments, becoming a hermit, an exile of science. He searched for an inert substance that could, like a sponge, absorb the liquid death, turning it into a safe paste. He tried hundreds of materials, from coal dust to brick chips, but all was in vain. The solution, as it often does, came by accident, from a frustrating mishap. When transporting liquid nitroglycerin in tin cans, they were packed for cushioning in kieselguhr, a light, porous, sedimentary rock composed of the fossilized remains of diatoms. One day, while receiving a shipment, Alfred noticed that one of the cans had leaked. He braced for the worst, but there was no puddle. The treacherous liquid had been completely absorbed by the kieselguhr, forming a dense, pliable, slightly damp paste. His heart stopped. This was the moment of truth. He carefully took a piece of the mass. It didn't react to the warmth of his hands. He struck it with a hammer. Nothing. He held a lit match to it. It didn't explode, but burned with a steady, calm flame, like sealing wax. But when he inserted his detonator into the paste and lit the fuse, a deafening explosion echoed over the desolate waters of the lake. Eureka! He had found it. He had found the perfect balance. Kieselguhr made nitroglycerin completely safe to store and transport, but didn't prevent it from releasing its monstrous power upon detonation. The beast was tamed and chained. He gave his invention a powerful, punchy name, dynamite, from the ancient Greek word dynamis, meaning power. In 1867, he received the patent that would change the world. He stood on the threshold of immense wealth. He had avenged his brother's death by completing their shared work. But he did not yet know that in taming one demon, he had unleashed another, far more terrifying and insidious. A demon that would stain his name, turn his life into a gilded cage, and ultimately force him to seek redemption. The age of dynamite had begun, and with it, the age of the invention of dynamite was not just another 19th century patent. It was the that created a new universe, the universe of industrial capitalism as we know it. If the steam engine was the heart of this era, dynamite became its muscles, a raw, unstoppable force capable of reshaping the very landscape of the planet. Humanity, which for centuries had chipped away at rock with primitive pickaxes, cursing its weakness against the power of nature, suddenly held a tool of almost divine might. Projects that had once seemed the far-fetched fantasies of romantic engineers became reality. The monumental Gotthard rail tunnel, which pierced the heart of the Alps to connect the industrial north of Europe with its sunny south, became dynamite's first and greatest triumph. 15 kilometers of the hardest granite were conquered in record time, where workers with pickaxes and inefficient black powder had once advanced by inches a day, losing hundreds of lives in cave-ins and gas poisonings. Nobel's explosions now cleared the way by meters. The Corinth Canal in Greece, which turned the Peloponnese Peninsula into an island. The Panama Canal, which linked two oceans. The transcontinental railroads in the United States, laying steel tracks through the impassable Rocky Mountains. All these marvels of engineering would have been impossible without the pliable, reddish cartridges labeled .27. The gold mines of South Africa, the copper mines of Chile, the coal mines of Germany, the entire global economy began to pulse to the rhythm of Nobel's explosions. And here, in this brutal world of big money and merciless competition, the melancholic, withdrawn scientist Alfred Nobel revealed another side of himself to the world, that of a steely, pragmatic, and utterly ruthless businessman. He did not take the easy path of selling licenses, as many inventors did. He decided to control everything himself, from production to distribution. He began building the first truly transnational corporation in history. His factories, producing dynamite and later other more advanced explosives, sprang up across the globe with astonishing speed. He clawed his way into every market, waging endless, exhausting patent wars, not shying away from industrial espionage, bribing officials, and crushing competitors through dumping. Eventually, his industrial network grew to 93 factories in over 20 countries. He became the first citizen of the world in the modern sense. His life turned into a ceaseless whirlwind of trains, steamships, hotel rooms, and boardrooms. He might have breakfast in Paris, lunch in Cologne, and dinner in London. The newspapers that followed his movements dubbed him Europe's richest vagabond. He was a workaholic, obsessed to the point of self-annihilation, sleeping only 4 or 5 hours a night. But the wider and more powerful his empire grew, the deeper and more desolate the desert of his loneliness became. He owned a luxurious villa in an aristocratic Parisian neighborhood and a magnificent estate in sunny San Remo. But he could call neither place home. A dead silence reigned in their cavernous, lavishly furnished rooms. He had thousands of employees, but not a single true friend to whom he could confide his fears, his doubts, and the torments of his conscience. He never married and left no heirs. In his letters, full of bitter self-irony and profound pessimism, he wrote to his brother Robert, "I would leave behind not just an obituary, but a will, if I had anyone but your children to leave anything to. I am growing old, and there is a void around me." And, of course, there was the dark, sinister side to his triumph, the side that fed his wealth and relentlessly tormented his conscience. Industrialists built, but militaries killed. Dynamite and its derivatives proved to be the perfect filler for artillery shells, torpedoes, and mines. Generals in every army in the world applauded Nobel. Every new war, whether in Europe or the colonies, brought him fabulous profits. Alfred himself could not fail to see this. And, paradoxically, he did not stop. The thrill of scientific discovery and his business acumen outweighed his moral qualms. In 1887, he patented ballistite, the world's first effective smokeless powder. It was a true revolution in warfare, making combat even more lethal, and the nickname bestowed upon him by the press stuck to him for good. He tried to defend himself by formulating a cynical theory of, arguing that the more destructive the weapons became, the less desire politicians would have to start wars. He wrote sarcastically to peace activists, but deep down, in the sleepless nights, he knew it was just self-deception. And in this scorched desert of loneliness and inner turmoil, there were only two distant, flickering lights in his life. Two women who left a deep and indelible mark. And they were as different as dynamite for construction and dynamite for destruction. The first was Bertha Kinsky, an Austrian countess who had fallen on hard times and answered his advertisement for a secretary in Paris in 1876. Their collaboration lasted only a week, but it laid the foundation for a lifelong friendship and correspondence. The 43-year-old Nobel was captivated by her lively mind, her education, and her warmth. She, in turn, was struck by his genius, his erudition, and his cosmic loneliness. But Bertha's heart belonged to another, the young Baron Arthur von Suttner, and unable to bear the separation, she fled Paris to secretly marry her beloved. As Baroness von Suttner, she dedicated her life to the cause of peace, writing the world-famous anti-war novel, Lay Down Your Arms. In her letters, she became Nobel's conscience, his intellectual opponent, constantly reproaching him for profiting from death and urging him to direct his colossal funds toward the cause of peace. The second woman was Sophie Hess, a simple flower seller from the Austrian spa town of Bad Ischl. He met her when he was 43 and she was just 20. She was his secret, his desperate attempt to buy what money cannot buy. Simple human warmth and love. He supported her for nearly 18 years, rented her a luxurious apartment in Paris, showered her with money and gifts, and hired tutors for her. He called her 35 in hundreds of letters. She called him, but the gulf between them was insurmountable. He was a genius living in a world of ideas. She was a simple, down-to-earth girl who wanted only dresses, entertainment, and a carefree life. Their relationship, filled with quarrels, jealousy, and reconciliations, brought him more suffering than joy, but he clung to it like a drowning man to a straw. Thus, in the twilight of his life, Alfred Nobel was a man who had everything and nothing. An industrial king whose name thundered across the globe, and a deeply unhappy, ailing old man, torn apart by inner demons, the pangs of conscience, and an unbearable loneliness. And then, in 1888, he read his own obituary, which, without mincing words, simply and terrifyingly called him. He saw his reflection in the eyes of history, and the sight was unbearable. He realized that neither his factories, nor his millions, nor his hundreds of patents could wash away this stain. Something else was needed, something radical, something that would make the world remember the name Nobel, not with the sound of an explosion, but with a sense of hope. The decision ripened, and it would be as powerful and as devastating to the expectations of his contemporaries as his greatest invention. That ill-fated obituary in 1888 was more than a shock to Alfred Nobel. It became his cold, relentless companion. The image of the, quote, 38, drawn by the journalist's merciless pen, took up residence in his mind like a ghost. It sat with him at his desk in his lavish Paris mansion, accompanied him on his sleepless journeys across Europe, and whispered in his ear in the silence of his laboratories. The thought of his posthumous reputation, once merely a background anxiety in his melancholic soul, now became a deafening, obsessive idea. He understood with chilling clarity that in the history books of future generations, he risked being ranked alongside the greatest villains, a genius of destruction, whose name would be spoken with shudders and curses. For a man who, deep down, and despite all his cynicism, considered himself a humanist and an idealist, this prospect was tantamount to eternal torment in Dante's Inferno, which he so loved to quote. He had to give the world an answer to the terrible accusation. And that answer had to be loud, indisputable, and as eternal as science itself. The years that followed were a time of deep, agonizing reflection. He increasingly distanced himself from the day-to-day management of his sprawling empire, delegating tasks to trusted associates. His health deteriorated, angina attacks became more frequent, and the ticking of the clock in his study sounded to him like a countdown. He corresponded with Bertha von Suttner, debating with her the paths to achieving peace. He was sardonic, calling her peace congresses, but her passionate faith in humanity, her tireless energy, seemed to ignite a corresponding fire in his cynical, weary soul. He watched as Europe, intoxicated by nationalism and an arms race, slid inexorably toward the abyss of a world war, a war for which he himself supplied the fuel, his ballistite and dynamite on an industrial scale. He needed a formula, not a chemical one, but an existential one, a formula for redemption. On November 27, 1895, sensing that his life was drawing to a close, 62-year-old Alfred Nobel, at the respectable and somewhat stuffy Swedish-Norwegian Club in Paris, performed his last and most important act. Away from the hustle and prying eyes, he sat down at a desk and, taking a pen, wrote out his last will on 4 pages of ordinary paper. He wrote it himself, without the help of lawyers, a profession he despised for its ability to turn clear ideas into convoluted, multi-volume legal battles. For him, a scientist, this was a final formula, precise and calibrated. It was his third and final will, revoking all previous ones. He carefully folded this document, drafted in secret from everyone: his nephews in Sweden and Russia, his business partners in Germany and France, and his longtime mistress, Sophie Hess, in Austria, and placed it in his safe. This document would become his last, most powerful, and most constructive explosion. On December 10, 1896, at his villa, many sunny Italian town of San Remo, an ironic name for the home of a man who never built a family nest, Alfred Nobel died of a massive stroke. He died as he had lived most of his life, in absolute solitude. Only his Italian servants were with him, unable to understand a word of Swedish, watching helplessly as their great yet so unhappy master faded away. By a cruel Shakespearean twist of fate, to alleviate the agonizing angina attacks that had plagued him in his final years, his doctors had prescribed him small doses of nitroglycerin, the substance to which he had dedicated his entire life, which had brought him fame, fortune, and damnation, returned at the very end to claim him. When the safe was opened and the will was read, the effect was like a time bomb detonating in the heart of the European establishment. The relatives, the Nobel family in Sweden and Russia, who were already mentally dividing his vast fortune, estimated at 33 million Swedish kroner, a colossal sum equivalent to hundreds of millions of dollars today, were in a state of shock that turned to fury. Their initial reaction was disbelief, followed by righteous indignation. They immediately hired the best lawyers in Europe to contest the will, arguing that their uncle had not been of sound mind in his later years, influenced by King Oscar II of Sweden, was enraged upon learning of the document's contents. He considered Nobel's will an act of national betrayal. From the perspective of a 19th-century monarch, Nobel had done the unthinkable. He had taken a huge amount of capital from the control of the Swedish crown and entrusted it to a supranational cosmopolitan entity. This was not just eccentric, it was subversive. The press worldwide erupted with headlines. The public was utterly bewildered. In an era when fortunes were passed down exclusively through inheritance, such a gesture seemed the act of a madman. And all because in his will, Alfred Nobel had directed the following. His entire vast fortune was to be converted into safe securities, which would constitute a fund. The annual interest from this inviolable capital was to be distributed in the form of prizes. He then clearly divided these prizes into 5 equal parts, for the most important discoveries in physics, chemistry, physiology, or medicine, for the creation of the most outstanding literary work in an idealistic direction, and finally, the 5th and most paradoxical, most sensational part, a prize to the person who, quote, the Peace Prize. This was his brilliant answer, his posthumous gambit. The, quote, had bequeathed his, quote, to the promotion of peace on earth. It was an act of supreme irony, a masterful plan to recode his own legacy. He used the money earned from weapons to reward those who fought against war. A long and grueling battle for Nobel's will began. It was a veritable war. On one side were the enraged relatives, the French government attempting to seize his assets, and the Swedish establishment. On the other were 2 young men, Nobel's executors, chemist Ragnar Sohlman and engineer Rudolf Liljequist. They showed incredible tenacity and loyalty. Sohlman orchestrated a genuine covert operation. Fearing that French authorities would confiscate Nobel's securities held in Parisian banks, he secretly transported them in a horse-drawn carriage disguised as personal effects and smuggled them to Sweden. For 5 years they fought in courts, negotiated with the government, and fended off attacks from the press. It was a battle of David against several Goliaths. And they won. In 1900, the King of Sweden reluctantly approved the statutes of the Nobel Foundation. And in 1901, on the 5th anniversary of Alfred's death, the first ever Nobel Prizes were awarded in Stockholm and Oslo. The lonely genius's dream had come true. Then, in 1905, the Nobel Peace Prize was awarded to his old friend, his intellectual conscience, Baroness Bertha von Suttner. The circle was complete. The will that had been called insane had begun its work. Alfred Nobel could not change or erase his past. He remains in history as the man who gave the world dynamite. But with his final and most brilliant invention, the prize, he created an alternative, immortal legacy for himself. He did not erase the old curse. He wrote a new, shining word over it. And today, when we hear the name Nobel, our first association is not the roar of explosions, but the triumph of the human mind and spirit. We think not of shattered mountains, but of the scientists, writers, and peace advocates who move mountains of ignorance, disease, and hatred. The merchant of death did not become a saint, but he managed to perform the greatest alchemical trick in history. He transmuted the lead of destruction into the gold of human progress. He did not erase the old, terrible formula he had written for the world. He inscribed a new, far more powerful one above it. The formula for hope. And therein lies his greatest, most unsolvable, and most magnificent paradox.